So thank you again for inviting me. So as you mentioned in this presentation, I will discuss the Ottoman reception of the Nuzhat al-Qulūb, the encyclopedic work on the natural world and geography by Ḥamdallāh Mustawfī Qazvīnī. As I was saying, I hope I will not be too much off topic for this webinar series because, of course, the Nuzhat is an Ilkhanid work, early 14th century. But today I will mostly deal with 17th century reception of the work in the Ottoman Empire. So I'll first examine the Persian manuscripts produced or circulated in the Ottoman Empire. This will be the first part of the talk. And then I will, in the second part, examine the Ottoman Turkish translation of the book, which was produced in Bidlīs in Kurdistan in the mid-17th century. And I will draw a brief conclusion based on the preliminary findings that I could obtain through this research. So let me now proceed to the first section. So just a few words briefly about Nuzhat al-Qulūb. I guess you all know more or less about it. This is a work that was completed around 1340 by Mustawfī Qazvīnī. It's his last known work. Mustawfī Qazvīnī was an Ilkhanid financial official who was also, among other things, governor of Qazvin in the source of his career. So the book is written in Persian. It's made up of an opening discourse, Fatiha, 3 chapters, Maqala, and an epilogue, Khatama. The opening discourse is further divided into a Muqaddimah on planets, stars, the 4 elements, Anasir Arba'a, so air, water, earth, and fire, and a Dibache on the world's habitable quarter, Rubi Maskun, and the 7 climes, Iklim Saba'a. Then you have the 3 Makales. So the first Makale is devoted to the 3 elements, Nevale de Selassie, so namely minerals, vegetables, animals. Second Makale that discusses humankind, human nature, etc. And then a third Makale, the one for which the book is mostly known today, and which is the geographical part of the book, discussing the geography of Iran, cities and provinces in Iran, as well as in other countries. And then, of course, these 3 Makales are further divided into sections, subsections that are variously called Bab, Surat, Shekl, Nav, Vaj, etc. And then the book ends with a Khatime epilogue, which is a bit different. It's about the world's marvels and wonders. It is called Ajaib Kharaib. And so it has a bit of a less scientific character, let's say, than the rest of the book. Now, if we talk about the reception, the transmission and reception of the book, thinking about the Persian manuscripts and its reception in the Iranian world in general, and not just in the Ottoman Empire, we can see that this number of manuscripts indicates a fairly wide reception of the book. And this is also indicated by the frequency with which the work was cited in later Persian works, and also, in a more minor way maybe, the existence of a late 19th century lithographic edition. So more specifically as concerns the number of manuscripts, Mustafa Derayati's Ferastagan Nuskhahai Khati Iran lists 150 copies of the work kept in Iran alone. And then, of course, you have Charles Ambrose Story's catalog, which for its part lists 70 manuscripts, mostly kept in Western Europe and Russia. And so there is only 1 manuscript that is overlapping between these 2 books. And so if we consider how dated Story's work is, and consider also the fact that we don't really have the exact estimate for the number of manuscripts in Central Asia, South Asia, and also other parts of the former Ottoman Empire, we can estimate that we maybe have around 250 extant manuscripts of the book in total. But I mean, there is no specific work, as far as I know, that specifies that. So it was a very popular work. And then you have, of course, the lithograph produced in Bombay in 1893-94, which I could unfortunately not consult. But it is said in the secondary literature that it was not of a very good quality. But yet it is the only complete edition of the Nuzhat. And indeed, it is the book's third Makale, the geographical part, that has received the most attention, perhaps even the only attention in modern academia. So as you probably know, this part was edited twice. First by Guy Lestrange in 1916, who also provided an English translation in 1919, and then by Mohammed David Siaki in 1958. This is also the part that was discussed by Güneş Ekmekçi Ashan for her PhD dissertation on the Nuzhat al-Qulūb's Turkish translation, which we will discuss today, which I will discuss today. In addition, you also have a short edition and translation of the third martaba of the first makale, that is the zoological part of the work, the part dealing with animals, basically. And that was the work of John Stevenson in 1928. So this is basically for the manuscripts and the state of the art. Now, before moving on to the Persian manuscripts produced or circulated in the Ottoman Empire, I would like to say a few words on the Nuzhat's manuscripts in general, the Persian manuscripts, in order to see later on if the trends that we observe for all the Persian manuscripts are also manifest in those produced or circulated in the Ottoman Empire specifically. To the best of my knowledge, as I said, there has not been any study devoted to the Nuzhat al-Qulūb's composition, transmission, and reception in manuscript form. And so because of this and of the sheer number of manuscripts, I could only rely for now on manuscript catalogs to get some preliminary insights. So that means that for the Ottoman manuscript that I will discuss in more detail, of course, I looked at the actual, well, not the actual copies, actually the digital copies. But for these Persian manuscripts, in the broader sense, I only relied on the manuscript catalogs. So Fancha, Stories catalogs, some other individual library catalogs, and I had a look at some manuscripts in the British Library and in the BNF as well, but this is just a minor number as compared to the wide distribution of the work. So if we look at the Fancha catalog, we can see that out of a total of 115 manuscripts, only one is dated from before the 10th century of the Hijra, that is before the 16th century, and the advent of the Safavids in Iran. And this is a manuscript, so the oldest extant manuscript that is dated 809, 1406, 1407, so the early 15th century. And we encounter a similar situation in Stories catalog with one single manuscript dated from before the 16th century. And this is a manuscript kept in the BNF that is dated 1449. So this is not an uncommon pattern for manuscripts of Persian works in general, but the distribution of manuscripts across the other periods is a bit more surprising, at least for me. So in Fancha, we have 14 manuscripts dated to the 16th century, as you can see on the pie chart on the screen. 55 manuscripts dated to the 17th century, 9 manuscripts dated to the 18th century, 18 to the 19th century, as well as 18 more which are undated. So as would be expected, we have a surge in manuscripts during the Safavid periods, and especially in the 17th century. And again, as expected, a sharp decrease in the 18th century, which was a period of political instability in Iran. So again, this is something that we can see in a lot of works in Persian. However, I would have expected a much more important resurgence in the 19th century, as can also be seen with other Persian works, at least the ones that I have worked with, so mainly historiographical works. But this is not the case. I did not have the opportunity yet to prepare a full survey of the Nuzhat's Persian manuscripts kept in Europe, as presented in Story and in the individual catalogs. And I also did not get a chance to do so for the copies kept in India, Pakistan, and Central Asia, as well as other places. But I had like cursory look at all these manuscript catalogs. And what I can say is that a similar pattern of chronological distribution is to be expected for these manuscripts as well. So even though we should, of course, always be cautious when relying on the number of extant manuscripts, as they merely reflect what has been preserved, I think these clear numbers indicate that the 17th century was really the apex of the Nuzhat al-Qulūb's reception, transmission, copy, etc. Furthermore, in terms of spatial distribution, the same cursory survey shows that manuscripts kept in Europe mostly came from Iran and India, and the latter especially, of course, from manuscripts kept in the UK, and manuscripts kept in Iran mostly came from Iran as expected. So even though further research is needed for the purposes of this talk, which is the reception of the Nuzhat in the Ottoman Empire, I will just ignore these manuscripts as they do not seem to relate to the topic, and I will focus solely on the manuscripts of the Nuzhat al-Qulūb kept in Turkey today, which is a group that from this point onwards I will refer to as the Ottoman Persian manuscripts. So I have identified 11 such manuscripts, all of which are digitally available in the unified catalog of the Türkiye Yazma Eserler Kurumu Başkanlığı, which made it possible to analyze them all for this talk. As you can see in the table on the screen, in terms of chronological distribution, they follow more or less a similar pattern as the manuscripts kept in Iran and in Europe. One manuscript is dated to the year 881 of the Hijra, 1476, 1477. This is the oldest extant manuscript, Ottoman Persian manuscript, let's say. Whereas 6 manuscripts are dated to the 17th century, 2 to the 18th century, 1 to the 19th century, and 1 is undated. So again, we have a predominance of 17th century manuscripts that is notable. And we can say that the so-called Ottoman manuscripts do not diverge from the rest of the Nuzhat al-Qulūb's Persian manuscripts in that regard. Now, one important question to be answered concerning the Ottoman reception of the Nuzhat is whether these Ottoman manuscripts were produced in Ottoman lands or if they were only circulated there after having been copied in Iran. Now, unfortunately, only one of these manuscripts, as you can see again on the screen, features a place of copy. And this is manuscript Esad Effendi number 2505, kept in the Süleymaniye library. And this is also the most recent of the dated manuscripts, so it's quite a later example. It was copied in 1814 by a man called Murad Ali in Isfahan, in Qajar, Iran. So of course, a single manuscript out of 11 is not representative, and it does not allow us to draw conclusions. However, for 4 of the manuscripts, we have the names, especially the nisba of copyists, that might indicate or that indicate a connection to Iran. Of course, this doesn't mean that these manuscripts were actually copied in Iran, but at least the copyists were, in all likelihood, originally from Iran. So you can see the names of these copyists on the screens. Abul Hasan al-Ardabili, Hafiz Ordubadi, and Ali Tabrizi, Muhammad Rahim al-Isfahani. And these are also all more or less 17th century manuscripts, or at least 11th century manuscripts, if we talk in Hijra years. They are dated respectively 1008, 1009, 1072, and 1080 of the Hijra. We have the names, of course, of 2 other copyists, Anvari Bayani. This is the copyist of the oldest manuscript, by the way, and Shamsuddin ibn Mahtullah al-Musavi. But these names do not actually suggest any particular place of origin, so they cannot help us in that regard. So to sum up, the provenance of, let's say, 5 out of 11 manuscripts can perhaps be inferred. And all 5 of these were possibly produced in Iran and only later circulated in the Ottoman Empire. Of course, it's just a hypothesis. As I said, it's possible that these were copyists working in the Ottoman Empire, so Iranian copyists working in the Ottoman Empire. But it's likely that at least some of them were actually working in Iran and that these manuscripts came into the Ottoman Empire from Iran. So the preliminary hypothesis is that most of these so-called Ottoman manuscripts were in fact produced in Iran and not in the Ottoman Empire itself. So in order to try and look more into that, another point of interest, of course, is that of owners and potentially readers of these manuscripts. And this can be identified notably through seals and waqf notes present on the fly leaves and in the margins of the various manuscripts. Now, as you can see on this table, 5 of the 11 manuscripts have been in the possession of 4 Ottoman sultans, namely Selim I, Mahmud I, Osman III, and Mustafa III, and 3 others were owned by Ottoman statesmen, including one Grand Vizier, Nefshirli Damat Ibrahim Pasha, who died in 1730, as well as another statesman, governor in places like Erzurum, Diyarbakir, Damascus, called Çeteci Abdullah Pasha. He died in 1760, and also Mehmed Emin Vahid Pasha, governor of Aleppo and Anatolia, who died in 1828. We can also mention one manuscript that was in the library of Ottoman Sheikhul Islam Ismail ibn Mehmed Küçük Çelebizade, who died in 1760. And as for the two remaining manuscripts, they do not have ownership notes except seals to the name of the official chronicler, Pak-Anüvis Saflar Şehizade Mehmet Esad Efendi, which they also are part of his collection today in the Süleymaniye. So as can be seen, most of these ownership notes refer to individuals who lived in the 18th century, so about 1 century after the copy of the majority of the manuscripts. Here are some of the seals and possession notes, wakf notes related to these individuals. So you can have a brief look at this. You can notably see the seal of Selim I in the left corner, which might be of interest. And to sum up, this first part on the Ottoman reception, let's say, of the Nuzhat, at least of the Persian manuscripts of the Nuzhat, based on these 11 manuscripts that we have studied so far, if we consider that they are representative of this reception, first we can say that they represent a very small number of copies. So this is not even a tenth of what we find in Iran. And furthermore, these copies were likely or possibly also produced in Iran and only later circulated among a small group of high-ranking Ottoman elites, such as sultans, grand viziers, governors, Sheikh al-Islams in Istanbul. And although some of them were previously kept in other libraries in Turkey, the fact that most of the 11 manuscripts are today kept in the Süleymaniye library in Istanbul is a good manifestation, let's say, of this fact. Furthermore, the almost complete absence, actually let's say the complete absence of marginal notes, which is why I didn't actually show you any pages from any of these manuscripts. This further suggests that these manuscripts were not necessarily meant to be read. Rather, maybe they would have formed part of what was deemed to be an educated man's library in the Ottoman circles of power. And so based on this examination of the manuscripts, there is very little evidence that the Nuzhat al-Qulūb was a popular text in the Ottoman Empire, even in the 17th century. As for citations, I haven't browsed through all the Ottoman literature of that period yet, but as far as I could see, it is not mentioned in many works. I found it in the Kashf al-Zunud by Khatib Chalebi, which, as you know, is a mid-17th century bibliographical encyclopedia written in Arabic that has about 15,000 works included. So we would expect to find such a well-known work in it. We can say that Khatib Chalebi probably did see a manuscript of the work because it gives a rather detailed description of its contents. So this is one place where you can find it, and we can also find it not by name, I think, but used by Evliya Çelebi in his Seyahatname travelogue in a rather strange way. Basically, he uses some Mongol terms found in the Nuzhat al-Qulūb and claims that these terms are part of one of the Caucasian languages that spoken in one of the places that he has visited. So a bit of a, let's say, a fantasist way of using the work. And of course, both Khatib Chalebi and Evliya Çelebi were two rather original figures, standing, let's say, at the margin of the power circles and scholarly world, even though Evliya, of course, was also secretary of the governor of Van, Melek Ahmed Pasha. So he was related, of course, to these circles of power, but let's say they were known for having rather peculiar interests, notably in the natural sciences, geography, marvels and wonders, which is exactly the things that are discussed by Mustawfī. So we could say that these are not necessarily representative of the Ottoman reception of the work and stay on the preliminary hypothesis that the reception of the Nuzhat in the Ottoman Empire was mostly derivative from the Persian reception of the work. Now, there is another man that was in the Ottoman Empire interested, apparently, and quite interested in the work, and that is Abdāl Khān, the Kurdish emir of Bidlīs, who ruled between 1622 and 1664. Although he was not himself an author, he was very important in let's say, the Ottoman Turkish reception of the Nuzhat, since he was the one to sponsor the only known Turkish translation of that work in the mid-17th century. And this is the second part of my talk that I will now turn to. So first, a few words about this Abdāl Khān, as he might be lesser known than Mustawfī Qazvīnī and Awliya Chalabi and Khatib Chalabi. So Abdāl Khān was a member of the Rojikid ruling family in the Kurdish emirate of Bidlīs, which is today, let's say, a small city about 20 kilometers to the southwest of Lake Van. As you can see on this map, the upper left corner, well, near Lake Van, you can see Lake Van. So Bidlīs today is quite a small provincial city, let's say, but back then the emirate of Bidlīs, the Rojikid emirate, was really the most important and powerful Kurdish emirate, whether in the 16th or 17th century. And so Abdāl Khān is, we could say, a well-known figure in Kurdish and Ottoman history of the period. His grandfather, Sharaf Khan II, was, of course, the author of the well-known Persian chronicle of the Kurds, of Kurdish dynasties at least, the Sharaf Nameh. And his great-great-grandfather, Sharaf Khan I, had been instrumental in brokering the Ottoman-Kurdish alliance that led to victory against the Safavids at Chaldiran in 1514, and to, let's say, the affiliation of most of the Kurdish emirates with the Ottoman Empire at that time. So anyway, Abdāl Khān succeeded his father, Ziauddin Khan, as emir of Bidlīs on the 15th of June, 1622. This was about a month after the execution of Sultan Osman II, and also shortly before war broke out again between the Safavids and Ottomans in 1623. And so this was a troubled time in Bidlīs, as elsewhere on the chaotic Ottoman-Safavid frontier, but also a time of opportunity for local rulers in the borderlands. And Abdāl Khān eventually became a powerful figure in Kurdistan, navigating for a bit more than 40 years between loyalty to the Sultan on the one hand and a desire to elevate to greater political and economic power and independence on the other hand. He was eventually demoted by order of Mehmed IV in 1664, and his subsequent activities are unknown. But at least apparently he was not executed like his grandfather, Sharaf Khan II, and his great-great-grandfather, Sharaf Khan I, and many other Kurdish emirs. So this is at least an improvement. So yes, this Abdāl Khān, this appears clearly in the sources, notably in the Seatnameh by Awliya Chalabi. Awliya was in Bidlīs 3 times in 1655-56. It describes Abdāl Khān at length. He was the most powerful Kurdish emir in the 17th century, let's say. And the corollary of this power was also that he had great wealth, and he could afford to have, apparently in Bidlīs, a rich cultural and courtly life, which was definitely not the case in all of the Kurdish emirates. And again, this appears a lot in Awliya's text in the Seatnameh, and you can have a look at Robert Denkoff's edition of this part on Bidlīs to get a sense of that. Of course, Awliya exaggerates all the time, but we can hope that there is a part of truth in that as well. And actually, we don't have to hope. We know that there was actually cultural courtly life in Bidlīs because we are aware of a program of translation from Arabic and Persian into Turkish that was sponsored by Abdāl Khān in Bidlīs, and as part of which 3 works are extant today. At least 3 works that we know of, and there might be more works than that are yet to be found. So in addition to the translation of the Nuzhat al-Qulūb, to which I will come in a minute, the 2 other translated works are the Majmu'at al-Sanā'i, which is an anonymous Persian work devoted to various crafts and techniques, and the Kitab al-Rahma, a popular Arabic work of prophetic medicine by Muhammad ibn Ali al-Sanawbari, so dating to about the early 15th century. Sometimes this work is also attributed to As-Suyuti, but apparently it should rather be attributed to Al-Sanawbari. And now if we add the Nuzhat al-Qulūb to that list, we can clearly see that we have an interest on the part of Abdāl Khān in books dealing with the natural sciences, medicine, and encyclopedic knowledge in general. And this is also coherent with what we find in the Seatnameh about the personality of Abdāl Khān. Okay. Now the Nuzhat al-Qulūb translation, if we come to it, is extant in 3 manuscripts, so not a very wide circulation, as you can see. The translation's possible autograph is manuscript A979 of the Milli Kütüphane in Ankara. This is a richly decorated manuscript with an illuminated frontispiece and title page, including headboards and plant illustrations, as well as further illustration throughout, astrological tables, and a map. So it is quite common in also the Persian manuscripts in general to have these maps and astrological tables throughout the manuscript. But this particular manuscript is really quite fancy, let's say, as compared to the rest of the manuscripts, including the Persian ones. The manuscript comprises 308 numbered folios. However, unfortunately, the text of the translation is incomplete due to the accidental loss of several folios at the end of the copy in the middle of the 4th and last section, qasam, of the 3rd makale, that is the geographical part. So we know this is an accidental loss because the text stops in the middle of a sentence and we have a catchword at the bottom of the page. So this is a lacuna that is probably no longer than a dozen folios, but of course has an unfortunate side effect, and that is the fact that it deprives us of the colophon of this manuscript, which might have helped us to prove or disprove the volume's autograph status. And this manuscript also does not include the name of the translator, which is found in a note at the end of the translation, so is missing in this manuscript. I will come to that. Still, the preface and its sabab al-talif or sabab al-tarjama, maybe the reason for writing or translating, gives us some information about the translation. So there, the translator praises Ḥamdallāh Mustawfī's work as a jewel of artistry and a vault full of pearls, an achievement of the highest order, both masterfully succinct and deep, before mentioning his patron, Abdāl Khān, and noting that, this is the part that I have highlighted on the screen, since the book was in Persian, people who did not know Persian could not benefit from reading it, and now it has been translated from Persian and adorned in Turkish clauses. Now we have another extant copy of the Nuzhat al-Qulūb's Turkish translation that is also kept in Ankara's Milli Kütüphane with the call number A957. And this time the Terjemeh Nuzhat al-Qulūb is part of a majmua manuscript, which contains 2 texts. First, the Terjemeh Nuzhat, the first text of the majmua, and second, another unidentified text which discusses various drugs and medicines. And this is interesting because this tells us that apparently for the person who compiled this majmua, there was more interest in, let's say, the medicinal, vegetal parts of the work than in the geographical part. And actually, this is confirmed by the fact that we only have makales 1 and 2 in that manuscript, and not the 3rd makale on geography. However, again, the problem is that neither of these 2 texts features a colophon, so we don't know about the date of copy, the context of the copy, etc. And so, of course, since the 3rd makale is omitted, we also cannot supplement the lacuna that we have in manuscript A979 with that particular manuscript. However, we are lucky enough to have a 3rd and last known copy, which is manuscript number 2103 of the Bursa İnebey Kütüphanesi, which does feature the complete text of the translation, including the note at the end, which reiterates the translation purpose, the name of the patron, Abdāl Khān, and most importantly, includes the mention of the translator as Abdullah al-Merhab al-Padari, a man that is otherwise unknown to us. And this particular manuscript was copied in Dhul-Qa'dah 1108, so June 1697, in Hanya in Crete, and this is also coherent with the name of the copyist, which is Ibrahim al-Giriti. And so this gives us an interesting insight on the wide circulation of this translation, which is not wide in number, but at least apparently wide geographically speaking. Unfortunately, we cannot really, I cannot really say more about how this work ended up in Crete, how it was copied there, why, etc. Now, to speak briefly of the translation itself, the Terjemeh Nuzhat al-Qulūb is quite a literal translation, including in the choice of vocabulary used. resulting in a work which is written in a very Persianized form of Turkish. So I gave you like a simple example on the screen. Germ va khushk asts, which khushk, not khushk, which is rendered as germ ve khushk dur in Turkish. So basically, yeah, just Persian vocabulary and Turkish grammar, let's say. There are also many passages that are omitted, which sometimes renders the text virtually nonsensical. And this is especially the case in the geographical part. So I don't know if the translator got bored or he was less interested in that part, but this part is especially sloppy. Of course, we cannot say if these omissions should be definitely attributed to the translator, of this is a product of the copy that he worked with. But in any case, this part is greatly shortened. A more comprehensive study is also needed to see if we have any additions made to the text. As far as I could see, there are not. It's more like omissions, cuts, etc. But still, this should be checked. Now, what I am primarily interested in for this talk, however, is the audience of this translation. So beyond its patron, it is unknown exactly who this audience was. However, I can already say that contrarily to the Persian manuscripts today kept in Turkey that I showed in the first part, the Turkish translation apparently saw a lot more engagements, which I guess makes sense. If you want to go to the trouble of making a translation, it is probably for the text of it to be used rather than to be simply kept on the bookshelf. So first, the fact that one copy is part of Majmua, that is the manuscript A957, suggests an interest in the text for its content rather than as a nice object to have in a library. I mean, obviously someone was interested in having this text along another text for their personal use. And this is also something that we see with manuscript A971, where we have a significant engagement with the text by various readers in the form of paratextual notes. So indeed, this copy features notes by 4 individuals, as far as I could identify. And 2 of these readers notably left language notes in Turkish. And these dozens of notes are principally to be found in the Nuzhat's botanical section. So the section on plants, which is the second mertebe of the first makale. The first reader and annotator, which I will call from now on annotator 1, wrote in purple and red ink, and the second one, annotator 2, in black ink, which is convenient because it allows us to differentiate between them quite easily. And what they wrote in terms of notes are mostly language notes, giving the Turkish equivalents of botanical terms left by the translator in Arabic or in Persian. So indeed, whereas in the section on animals, the original Persian text itself usually contains the animals' names, also in Turkish and Mongol, this is not the case in the section on plants, perhaps because they are significantly more difficult to indicate and assert with precision. And so readers of the Persian original of the Nuzhat only have the Arabic and Persian words, which are sometimes supplemented by additional variants in Arabic dialects. And where it is a bit more surprising is that this is also the case for readers of the Turkish translation. So whether he lacked the confidence to add the Turkish equivalents of these terms, or he was unwilling to undertake the required research work, Abdullah al-Padari did not contribute this arguably essential element to aid in the reader's understanding of the text. I mean, if you translate parts of a book on plants and you don't translate the names of the plants, it's a bit unfortunate for a translation. And this is presumably why these elements were supplemented by the 2 annotators that I have mentioned just before. So to understand how they did this, we can, for example, we'll show a few entries, and we can look at the 9th entry of the section, for example, which is devoted to badruj, a type of flowering herb in the Lamiaceae family. And on the left, you have Mustawfī's entry on these plants, taken from manuscript Persian 127 of the National Library of France. And this entry reads, Badruj. Badruj in Persian is called kunduz. I mean, it doesn't say in Persian it is called so, but this is a typical, let's say, method that Mustawfī adopts in writing his entry. He gives the entry word in Arabic, then he gives the Persian equivalent. and then he gives some info about the particular plant or animal, whatever. So Badruj Kunduz, it is hot and dry, etc., etc. So we find again Garamba Hoshkast that we'll have in the Turkish translation in regard. And so this is translated exactly in the same way, as you can see on the right part of the screen, by Abdullah al-Padari. Badruj, they call it Kunduz derler. It is hot and dry, etc., etc. So in addition to writing in heavily Persianized Turkish, as mentioned earlier, the translator fails to provide a Turkish term for the plant. And so non-Persian and non-Arabic speakers, which would presumably be the audience of the translation, or anyone unfamiliar with plant names in these languages, would have no understanding of actually what plant is meant in this entry. And this is where the annotator writing here in red ink, annotator 1 intervenes by adding that in Turkish, it is known, so this plant is known as Tere Khorasani, so Türkçesi Tere Khorasani ile maruftur, which is indeed a Turkish name for the plant known in Arabic as Badruj, as I could check from other primary sources concerned with plants and botanical knowledge from the period. So this is pretty straightforward, right? We have this annotation by this reader, which is quite useful. But it is not always the case, and this is something that we see with the next entry, which is actually comes before the entry that I just showed. This is the 6th entry in this section, and this entry is devoted to the China berry tree, or Persian lilac, the scientific name of which, Melia Azad Deracht, derives from its Persian name Azad Deracht, which Mustawfī used here as the entry head. So Mustawfī writes Azad Deracht. It is called tak in Persian, and some of the Arabs call it asa. They also call it tahak in Persian. So in Persian, it's not written. I am adding this for clarity. And this is again rendered faithfully, or more or less faithfully, by our translator, albeit with a spelling mistake, perhaps coming from Persian manuscript that he used. So he writes Azad Deracht. It is also called taf, and asa. They also call it tahak. And so again, we do not have a Turkish term for the plant, and annotator 1 once more sets out to provide one in the margins, but he does so in a rather confusing way. He writes, they call it the seksek tree as well as the tespih tree, and it belongs to the gebere genre. Seksek ağacını derler ve tespih ağacını the gebere nebindendir. However, the seksek tree is the white saxol tree, and thus it has nothing to do with the China berry tree. The tespih ağacı is the Persian lilac, yet it is not part of the genre called gebere, that is caper bushes. So the confusion here might have stemmed from the Persian and Arabic terms provided by Mustawfī, tak and asa, which are very similar in written form to the Persian and Arabic terms for the saxol tree, tak and ada. So anyways, no need to dwell on the details here, but this and other examples show the extent to which the terms used to designate plants varied from region to region, and even from one speech community to the next, even among speakers of the same languages, and how this could cause frequent errors. And to try to remedy these shortcomings and make sense of this diversity, the people back then who were interested in these plants and in the vegetable world could refer to various books written on the subject. And so we have a certain number of works written, especially in the 17th century, on plants. And of course, these were works written mostly for medicinal purposes and the purpose of using these plants as drugs, etc. And this is also something that is most probably the interest of these annotators, these readers of this specific part of the Turkish translation of the Nuzhat. I don't have it here on the slides, but we have, for example, a note of one of the annotators who specifies that, okay, this plant is this type of medicine, etc., etc. So as I said, to remedy these shortcomings, these annotators in particular could refer to various books written on the subject. And this was especially necessary for people who were intent on going beyond mere linguistic remarks. And so while this annotator 1, the person writing in red ink, is rather sparing in this sort of instructional comments, the annotator writing in black ink, the second annotator, seems to have done more research than his predecessor in preparing his notes. And for example, this is manifest in his comments on the very first entry of the section devoted to the common myrtle. In Mustafī's text on the left, we read as, it is mord, so the myrtle in Persian, which some of the Arabs call rand. And this is translated again word for word into Turkish. And you have a note in black ink by annotator 2, who does not comment on the term rand, which is generally used for the bay laurel, rather than for the myrtle, as claimed by Mustafī. But rather, he provides further valuable information, writing in the bottom margin that in Turkish, this is the mersin tree. Its fruit is called habal as and hadasihaf. And he then names as his source the celebrated Lechet al-Lugat by Shaykh al-Islam Mehmed Esad Effendi, who died in 1753. So the Lechet al-Lugat is only mentioned this once by annotator 2, who also refers once to the Tuhfat al-Mu'minin, a multilingual medical and pharmacological treatise written in 1669 by Muhammad Mu'min Tonekabini, the court physician of the Savid Shah Suleiman I, to whom the book is dedicated. And so this is interesting because, I mean, apparently this annotator had access to this Persian work, this Persian Safavid work, in the Ottoman Empire in the, let's say, 18th century. And so these are two sources that are mentioned once, the Lechet al-Lugat, the Tuhfat al-Mu'minin. And we have another third source that is by far the most used source by this annotator. And this is the Nuzhat al-Tib, a book of pharmacology written by Emir Chelebi, which was the chief physician of Ottoman Sultans Mustafa I, Osman II, and Murad IV. So a very well-known figure, physician in the higher circle of the Ottoman Empire. And so this work is dedicated to the Kaptani Darya Topal Recep Pasha, died in 1632, and it was composed during the latter's tenure in 1623, between 1623 and 1626. The book is simply referred to here as Nuzhat, and it is mentioned by annotator 2 no fewer than 16 times. And this is consistent with the great popularity of that work in the 17th and 18th century. And so this, of course, also suggests that this annotator wrote his comments with the terminus postquem of 1732, which is the completion date of Mehmed Esad Effendi's dictionary. So he cannot have written his comments before this work was completed, since he cites it in his comments, obviously. Now I would like to briefly conclude by summing up some of the points raised in this talk. I mean, I could have shown many more annotations of this type, but this is more or less always the same thing. Brief conclusion: at first glance, the Nuzhat al-Qulūb does not seem to have been a very popular text in the Ottoman Empire. It is seldom cited. It is only extant in 11 known copies, Ottoman copies, most of which were maybe actually made in Iran. Furthermore, these 11 copies were mostly kept in the libraries of Ottoman statesmen and sultans, where they were likely included for reasons of prestige rather than for practical purposes. Now, the almost complete lack of marginal notes in all of these manuscripts also suggests this. Yet there was another less conspicuous circulation of the Nuzhat, far away from the imperial center of Istanbul. In Bidlīs, a Turkish translation of the work was produced, sponsored by the Kurdish emir Abdāl Khān Bidlīsi. Composed in the mid-17th century, this translation is extant in 3 manuscripts, one of which demonstrates signs of a significant engagement with the text by several different readers. As part of such engagement, these readers notably provided the Turkish names of plants omitted by both Mustafī and Abdullah al-Padari, the Turkish translator. Going beyond that, one of the annotators also tried to clarify issues of identity and use of some of these plants, relying for this on several pharmacological works. In this framework, it does not only refer to Ottoman works, but also to a book composed in Safavid Iran, suggesting a degree of cross-border circulation for these texts. And so I believe the example of Nuzhat al-Qulūb showcases the potential of studying the transmission and reception of text beyond an environment of production, as well as the importance of highlighting works produced, translated, copied, and read at local courts, and not only in the imperial center of Istanbul. And so this brings me to the end of my presentation, and thank you very much for your attention.